Yeah, Jesse and I had a fantastic conversation the other day. And I just had a sneaking suspicion that she'd be back today. Oh, and we got Joy too. All right. We have some regulars.
Good to see.
Yeah.
So,
Hi, Joy.
Hi, good to see you.
You too.
Yeah, so I think what we'll do is we'll wait for a few more minutes just to see if anybody else peters in at the last second, and then we'll kickstart this thing off. But I'm curious, Jesse, if you've had any time to play around with that agent that we set up.
So, sadly, I have not, but I went home very, very excited about it. It's like, this is my homework for the break.
Yeah, you have time. But sometimes people are just like, oh, I got to play with it right now.
I wanted to. I was just busy grading, and there's so many other things going on. But I went home and I talked to my partner and said, I am so, I haven't been this excited about. I mean, I'm always excited about pedagogy, but I'm really excited about technology, which is rare. Like, how do I learn these new things so that I can gamify my class and think about it differently? So I haven't gotten to play with it much, but our conversation is still energizing me and exciting me about going more deeply into that, into developing those skills.
Well, boy, did you come into the right workshop.
Yay.
Yeah, so I think we get in enough people, enough grace time. So if they come in after this point, we'll be very cordial and welcoming, of course. But I think I would like to pass it off to Nigel here, where we will begin our second presentation on gamification, the filler episode.
yeah, so, hello and welcome to the second in this series of gamification presentations. My name is Nigel Pingree, and I will be continuing to talk your ear off. So you'd probably remember from last time, we mostly talked about sort of the introduction to the concept and some of the sort of, I guess, a cagey way to put it is essentially trying to justify our existence, because a lot of what we will be kind of fighting against, trying to get this rolling, try to get this ball rolling, is skepticism. And that goes with anything that's new, but also it's incredibly easy to just sort of dismiss something like fun and games from something oh so terribly serious like education and the betterment of mankind and all of this. So we kind of got that out of the way last time, and this time we're going to be getting into some more of the theory and some of the actual mechanics of what we'll be doing, as well as some examples from the commercial world of video games, but also some of the more well-established historical examples, things like chess, which we're all hopefully familiar with. So shall we move on to the first slide?
The first slide, gotta get my mouse active here. And ta-da!
So yeah, just sort of reestablish, what is it exactly that gamification's purpose is? What are we doing here, really? And honestly, what it's all about is it's about removing resistance from the path of a given student, right? And you look at pretty much any task that you want to accomplish, there are things that you can do to make it easier. And that seems like an incredibly simplistic statement, because it is. But anyone who's trying to do something is going to encounter small points of resistance. Like, for example, if you want to clean a room in your house, right? What are the things that are going to cause stumbling blocks? Well, okay, you've got to actually do the task. That's one thing. But your own personal motivation to do it is one element. How much you actually have to do to accomplish a task is another element of it. And then all of the other things that you can tell yourself that you should be doing that are more important are also another element of that. And all of the reasons why you don't want to be doing it, or that you're hungry, or that you've got a friend coming over, and all of these other things that can kind of tip the balance one way or another. So the goal here is to try to tip the scales of motivation, right? To try to make it as easy and to remove willpower from the equation as much as possible. That's really that's the core of what we're trying to do here. And that's why gamification is a simple choice. Because if you take a task like eating healthy, or getting to bed on time, or getting enough exercise, and you associate things that, just remove some of the drudgery or the feeling like it's work. If you remove those things from the equation, well, suddenly it's a lot easier to do things that you should be doing otherwise. So you add points and achievements to getting enough exercise every day, and soon you're training your brain into being excited to do those things because you're working toward something that's tangible and easy to see. We can see that in a lot of very popular genres of television. Anime particularly is very good at leveraging people's desire to see those kinds of elements in their day-to-day life, and people kind of gravitating towards the escapism of some of those shows that have utilized that, right? There are even, I think, Jim, you're familiar with at least a couple of book series that are also actually kind of getting in on that and starting to do some stuff with that. And video games, obviously, huge with that. They're great at making things that you would ordinarily not enjoy doing seem fun for some reason. So, and we'll get into making torturous tasks fun later. We'll discuss that in a later slide.
Yeah, I even have another example that I've done before. Some workout equipment even comes with screens that have video games. Like I used to go on this bicycle one, and you could choose the course that you'd be traveling on, and based on the course, it would have different difficulty levels, and then you would measure your performance against either your previous performance or other people's performance. So it was actually something very motivating to go do and play, because you'd see, hey, how well am I doing versus I was before, and how am I comparing to other people?
Right. Actually, that reminds me, gym bros, some of the most lovable among us, have actually been in on this for a long time. Bodybuilders have long since understood that gamifying their workout sessions is an incredibly powerful tool for motivation. So you'll have exercises that are obviously pretty grueling, but they will have even something as simple as just like a notepad, and they'll record their previous best so that they can compete against themselves, so that they can continue to motivate that the progression and improvement. And if they're not doing that at all, and if they're just kind of going and not recording any of that stuff and not graphing any of that improvement, it's just that much more defeating whenever you're exhausting yourself at the end of a workout session. So that's another good example of how this is actually a thing that we've seen previously. And you also reminded me with your example, Jim, that Mavis Beacon's typing training games from, like, I want to say the late 90s to very, very early 2000s, absolutely a thing. They had little games that would teach you how to type. I played those when I was a little kid, and I can type pretty well. So
yeah, I remember those.
Video games are genuinely the reason why I have a very fast and accurate typing speed. But we'll talk about that another time. Moving on, though. All right. So our first obstacle. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about here is, sort of the challenges that we face when we try to gamify a course. And so the first thing that we run into is translation, right? So you're not necessarily starting from scratch and just building something custom for a subject. You maybe already have a syllabus, and you maybe already have a course that is functioning, that is working, and you want to preserve as much of it and as much of what makes it currently work as you can, while moving it into or like applying gamification principles to what you have currently. And that's hard, right? Build something from scratch has its own challenges, but in that case, you're going to be able to build something probably working with somebody who is familiar with game principles, and that person who's familiar with game principles is going to be kind of solving some of the issues that we're going to talk about with translation. So the first suggestion that I have for anyone who is doing this, who's taking a course and trying to apply gamification principles to them, is going to be to collaborate. Doing this in isolation is possible, but
it is
I can't imagine that you'd be successful even close to as often as you would be if you're collaborating with somebody. And I want to suggest that, and we'll talk about this more in other slides, but I want to suggest specifically collaborating with people outside of your field, because expertise leads to a lot of blind spots. And I have a great anecdote about that, which I will talk about a little later. So let's roll it.
Let's roll it to the next one.
Yep. Before I get into talking about our little character here, just think about like if you have a course that you want to be applying these principles to, and you want to be gamifying and building out that way, see if you can imagine some of the sticking points. Like, what are some of the pieces? What are some of the ideas that you already know that students struggle with? Because chances are good that as you've taught this class over the years, if you've taught a class many times, that you'll have figured out just by trial and error, like where students will trip and fall a lot. And so what we're trying to avoid here is that as you rebrand your class, kind of, you're gonna end up encountering all different stuff that's going to be hard, because the gamification might make some of the things that you would have expected to be hard easy, and it might make some of the things that were previously easy oddly challenging. So it'll shuffle things up, and we want to try to avoid those sticking points as much as possible. I mean, some of it's unavoidable, but that which can be avoided, so much the better. So I'm going to introduce something, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but I promise it has some application. A small part of this was just that this was fun when we were making the presentation. But how many people here have ever heard of the character Spiders George in day-to-day pop culture in passing? Nobody?
I've never heard of it either, by the way, so don't feel bad.
Yeah. Okay. So this is part of me being, I'm not quite half of his age, but I'm on the younger side, and I have to acknowledge that. I spent a lot of time on the internet, so I come across a lot of these things, but not nearly as much as somebody who is entering college. Spiders George was kind of a joke during my era as a student, and it was basically a product of this factoid that someone came up with when they said, on average, everyone eats 3 spiders a year because they sleep with their mouth open. Now, this is not true, but it was convincing enough, and it was a sort of a viral enough idea and disturbing enough that people repeated it a lot, as people are wont to do on the internet. So what came out of that was this joke about Spiders George as a statistical outlier, being that there's that one guy who lives in a cave somewhere and eats 20 billion spiders a year, and he's skewing the graph all the way up to where it looks like everybody's eating a bunch of spiders, right? It's ridiculous and a huge joke. And people who are within 5 years of my age might occasionally joke about Spiders George. Is that important? Not particularly. But the reason that I bring it up is because it's a reference that I understand that maybe none of you, or maybe only a couple of you, do, and that people younger than me might and might not. And the world is full of stuff like this. And keeping an eye out for it, or an ear out for it, is going to be helpful, particularly for making things relatable and interesting and funny for students who are passing through your courses. And it's also kind of my pitch for eventually, in sort of the end stages of all of this, encouraging people to try to leverage the creativity of the students as much as possible, because they are going to know what tickles their own funny bones. They're going to know what's funny and what's relevant more reliably than we ever will. Because I can make this joke for a bunch of people in my peer group, and it's going to go over a storm. And I think that there's some other graphics that in some of our later stuff that is also entirely for my own entertainment. So that's kind of why I bring this up. It's also with the eye toward the discussion of statistical outliers. So let's kick it to the next slide real quick. So we'll get back to that discussion of statistical outliers, but statistics and outliers are important to think about when we're looking at demographic appeal. So games suffer from the same thing that everyone else does, or everything else does, which is that some people like them, but some people don't. Some people like different most people like games, pretty much everyone, but the appeal of certain elements of games is different across different cultures and with different gender demographics and things like that. So we have to bear this in mind. The place where this is the most important is for our lower level classes. So the way we've kind of mapped this out in our head is, in a perfect world, what we would want to do is we would want to have this so that your 100 and 200 level classes are the most gamified and the most narratively souped up, if you will, and your 300 and 400 level classes are more geared into, are closer to what you currently teach, but with an eye towards the production and sort of the professional side of producing the material for these 100 and 200 level courses as much as it can be. So I think I have a note to talk about this later, but it makes sense to talk about it now. So I'm going to talk about it now. If you imagine a person who wants to teach say, a chemistry class, and so you have a professor who goes and visits Creative Writing 305, and they sit down and they pitch to the students in that classroom. They say, all right, I have a class. This is the material that I want to communicate. And these are some of the things that I'm familiar with and that I'd be comfortable doing, some of the roles that I'd be comfortable filling. Make me a happy teacher. Come up with something and get back to me in 3 weeks. And so that day, that a class of creative writing students split up into 4 groups, and they all brainstorm. They come together and they all pitch their ideas for what the best narrative experience would be to convey the material for this chemistry class. And they all together vote on and refine that idea. Then the next week or the next class session, they all ship off and they go and they pitch their idea to the music students and the art students at a similar level. And they say, this is a thing that we want to create, and we're going to need this kind of material. And this may not be the order that it would go in, because realistically, they might end up going to the computer science kids and having the computer science kids then go and make those requests of the art students. But basically, in my hope, you would have these students being able to create at the higher levels these sort of professional production classes that would then give the lower level classes relevant material that they can relate to and that they're interested in and that they find fun. And it would also give the higher level classes professional credit for their resume, and something that they'd be able to show to a potential employer later on. Hey, I did a thing and it was successful, and that has a lot of value. So that's kind of my 2 cents there. But when it comes to some of the conversation around demographic appeal, the thing that I wanted to talk about the course level curve is that at the low level courses, we would want to generally be trying to design classes that are as demographically agnostic as possible, to make sure that, as students try to figure out what they want out of their degree and they sort of shop around in all of the different courses, that they can feel comfortable in pretty much any course that they're taking at the 100 or 200 level. And then at the 300 and 400 level, when people are probably only in those classes because they are majoring in that sector, that we can start to make determinations and use more polarizing mechanics for things as we choose to use them. So, for example, there are some professions that are going to be predominantly occupied by a certain demographic. And so if that demographic has a preference for a particular game mechanic, then we're free to use them. And another thing would be if there is a need in a particular profession for people to be tolerant of a certain type of pressure, then we can feel free to apply that particular type of pressure. So a good example would be something like neurosurgery. There's really zero tolerance for making mistakes. So you can have incredibly intolerant pass-fail mechanics for a subject like that, because if you mess up, it means somebody dies. So it's okay to be very punishing for gamifying a course like that. But where with something that's a little bit softer, like, say, training somebody in clinical psychology, there's a little bit more of a human factor. There's a little bit more empathy, and there's just a little bit more of a conversation about whether or not something is right or wrong. There's an argument to be made in some cases. So you might not use a hard pass or fail mechanic, and you might have something a little bit different going into that, right? You might have a scale. You might have a situation where a student might be able to actually argue their case for a grade in some cases. I remember that happened in a couple of my classes where I had a professor who would say, for quizzes, he would say, if I've graded you a certain way, you look and you check your grades and you disagree with a mark that I've given you, please feel free to come up and argue your case. Because if you are convincing enough, this is linguistics. Like, things are fuzzy. Grammar and linguistics and language are a funny thing, and you can look at things from multiple angles. So if you can make a compelling enough case and it's based in what we're talking about here, then I might just change your grade, or I might give you half credit for something. So there was really like a second test occurring in a lot of those things. And I think that that's something that can absolutely be used for some subjects. So anyway, that's my small tangent into that. But shall we? I've just noticed, are these chats? Oh, okay. These are just you.
Yeah, that's just me greeting anyone. And if anybody feels like speaking up or sending a chat for a question or a comment, I'll bring it up when there's an adequate pause or something like that. Is there any other questions that we can forward to the audience? Any ideas that are coming to mind? No?
If nobody has any questions, then I have a question for the audience, which is, who here does not like to lose?
You can raise your hand. It's fine.
Yeah, you can raise your hand. You can say aye. You can put something in chat. Does anyone here have a difficult time losing at games and things? Don't really mind? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I hate losing, but I think that's the thing about video games is you get so many chances, because if you're like, I'm just going to try to get the final boss, but at least I can go for my last save point.
Now, we will be talking about some games that give you a lot of chances and some that don't a little. I wanted to think about when you don't like losing, and then think about if there's an example of a game. So you would have already just been thinking about this, examples of games and examples of situations where you really don't mind, and thinking about what it is about that specifically that just makes it okay.
Well, you learn how to beat the boss, or you find, you find the best way for you to be able to move forward.
Right. And Jesse, your message, I see that. I actually, similar situation, my own mother, her mother was super, super competitive. And so it ended up kind of making my mother just completely dissociate from competition and games altogether, because just couldn't, nope, not going to go there because it just brings up stuff. It's not worth it. So I understand. So yeah, let's kind of bear that in mind. And then let's move into the next slide. And we'll come back to that a little bit. Now, here's one of those pop culture references that I think is hilarious. And maybe some of you understand this one as well. But anyway, so leadership and the paradox of profession, as I like to put it. So when I was taking the grammar course that I've talked about a whole bunch in college, pretty quickly I ended up getting a student job with that professor. And I worked with him over break to redesign the course, because when I took it originally, we just couldn't fit all of the material into the semester. So we sat down and we kind of tried to figure out where can we have some of these assignments, and what chapters can we cut out, and how can we approach some of these things, because we knew a lot of the students were having a really hard time. And we did a terrible job. And the reason we did such a terrible job is because the two of us suffered from both being statistical outliers like our boy Spiders George. We were both really talented at this specific subject. And so we didn't understand what was making some of these things difficult for people. We knew that it was difficult, but we didn't know why. We didn't know how to make it better either. So all we could really do was run the class like 5 or 6 times and just sort of see what stuck to the wall. And we would prefer not to do that if possible. So that's kind of where we come into the conversation about the paradox of profession, right? Which is that when you're an artist, this is our first bullet point on the slide here. When you're an artist, the least important metric for success is your talent as an artist. I'm a very good writer, I would like to say. I'm not published as a writer. I'm published as an editor. But I'm not published as a writer because I'm not a particularly motivated or talented marketer. I'm a good enough public speaker, but I don't know a whole lot about advertising. I don't know a whole lot about, I know a bit about it, but I'm not motivated to do it. I'm not knocking down people's doors and trying to get everyone to publish me. That's just not really who I am. And so I've suffered for that. And so with that in mind, my guess is And again, we're talking generalizations, so I'm 100% certain that every single person here is a statistical exception to my assumptions here. So don't take any of this personally. But I would assume that in general, most people who are teaching classes at the college level who have achieved a terminal degree in their subject are going to be, on average, fairly talented in that field. And so when confronted with the task of assembling a course and creating a game, when asking that person what makes their subject fun, the answer that they're going to give right off rip is probably going to be wrong. When someone asks me what makes grammar fun, my answer is going to be the joy of language, obviously, the punctuation. Well, like, come on. Everybody groans when they hear, but English and English grammar, and I know that from experience. Like, people hate this language, and I absolutely adore it. So we can't be trusted. And so that's why earlier I said you want to try to work with people who are outside of your particular field, not only because they will cover your blind spots when it comes to what makes your subject interesting, but also because they'll offer you things from their own field that you might not have otherwise considered. A math teacher might not consider using music to teach and or gamify their course, and might not consider using sports as a way to teach their class, might not consider using video games to teach their class, all of these sorts of things. So it doesn't matter what that profession is that you're collaborating with, but collaborate with somebody who does something else, because otherwise you're going to end up like me and my friend Marcus, who are trying to put together this class, and we're both scratching our heads thinking, I just don't understand why they don't like grammar. don't be that guy. So yeah. And the reality is that game design and video games is, like, for a lot of you, not all of you, to be sure, but for a lot of people who are busy and successful and employed, is going to often be a new skill. And where a lot of students have had a lot of free time during their childhood, or have maybe stolen a lot of free time from their education to become literate in these concepts. A lot of people who are much older and dedicated their time and their efforts to their careers may not have been able to dedicate as much time to this sort of stuff. So some of you will be familiar with a lot of these ideas, but some of you will not. And that's okay. And that just means try to work with other people outside who maybe do. And if whoever you're collaborating with doesn't know what's going on either, that's what the department for helping you do this exists for. So you can bug Jim about it. And through him, you can bug me. I have lots of time. And the other thing is, as a result of your expertise and of your specialization, you are going to have strengths, right? You're going to have experience as a teacher, either as a public presenter. Some of you may be very good orators. Use that strength. Build games that leverage that. Some of you may be incredibly well suited for, like, game show styles like Jeopardy, where you can use your skills as an orator to craft and set expectations for sort of a conceit, and you can make things kind of fun and shiny for like a Jeopardy or a Wheel of Fortune style game show or something like that. And some of you may have a lot of technical expertise that enable you to create something where the thing that you've built, maybe the computer program, will do that for you because maybe that's a weakness of yours. So try to use whatever strengths you have. And yes, I have gather your party down here. Collaborate with this one person.
Yeah, find those people that have those strengths that you might not have. And it's because nobody's good at everything. Even those of us that you're taking advice from, we're not necessarily great at this. We're all trying to fumble our way through this, but we feel that we're onto something that's extremely important. And when I've communicated that to Jesse, like Chris, like, you see the value that's there and it gets you excited. It has that inspiration that it fills you up with. And we're trying to roll with that. We're trying to transfer that inspiration from you through to the students using this vector.
All right. And I think I see that our next slide is the one where I would have otherwise been talking about course networking, like the example about a chemistry class that would talk to the creative writing, who would then talk to art and computer science and maybe engineering and things like that. But yeah, I was very, very proud of this slide. Be not afraid. It's a collaborative effort. And I know that I'm parroting the same thing over and over again, but really work together on these things. It's new territory and it's okay to fail. We'll be talking more about how it's okay to fail in just a minute.
Well, I think that to reinforce the point is that when we're talking about universities, and a lot of this has been working a long time in university scenarios, we're in very strict siloed departments that don't really talk with each other very much outside of required interactions and meetings. And so because we don't, or whoever doesn't go around and physically interact with these other departments and see what things are possible and what are available, a lot of people don't know what they can do if they just go out and ask. And so it can be an entire other journey of exploration and adventure in many cases, just going to another department and saying, hey, I have an idea. Because that's how this whole thing started. I went around, I was saying, hey, I have this idea. What do you think about it? And that helped me identify instructors who are interested in the idea. And then because they're interested, I'm connecting them with the other instructors who are interested. And then everybody starts talking and working together. And so you have to get out of that comfort zone to begin with. We have to be uncomfortable and then suddenly find out that our community is a little bit larger than just the ones that we're seeing every day.
Right. So it might look like we've gone and blown through this whole presentation, but then we have our final slide, which is just going to be, we're going to sit and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the random topics that we threw together of some tangents that I wanted to go on that we couldn't find a real, good arc for them to fit into. So some basic stuff. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the game genres out there and their classical forebears and things that some of you may not end up ever really having time to explore in their entirety. And I personally haven't either. We're all born at whatever point in history we are, and that's fine. There's some mechanics that have been kind of innovated in the games industry over the course of time that have names dedicated to the sort of the originators, right? Like MMOs or massively multiplayer online games. I think the first MMO ever made was actually like a dogfighting sim from '87.
Oh my God.
But generally people will kind of quote either EverQuest or World of Warcraft as the games that made MMOs into the sort of the giant genre that it is now, right? And World of Warcraft is kind of an impossible titan to ever get away from. I've never played World of Warcraft. Am I doomed? No. Jim's played World of Warcraft. He's got me covered. And I know enough about World of Warcraft from other things that I've interacted with to where I can get away with it. And there are a lot of other games that are inspired by and really born out of the legacy of World of Warcraft and EverQuest and Neverwinter Nights and these things that allow me to kind of participate in that conversation, right? So it's fine. But there are some other things like Metroidvania and TCGs, the love children of Magic the Gathering and all of these sorts of things that are kind of important to at least have a general idea of what they are, even if you don't ever play through them all on your own. So we were kind of debating whether or not it's worth ending up creating a series at some point and sort of figuring out whether or not there's any interest in a series like this where we could try to acquire some of these titles and maybe play through some of them with an audience of any of you who are interested in learning a little bit about what it is that these titles have to offer. Because that might seem like kind of an excuse to sit around and play video games and chat, but I want to bring your attention to a couple specific titles that I think have a genuine lot to offer. So I want to talk about Dark Souls and the Soulsborne franchise, and then also another game that's similar called Noita. They're both what we would refer to as kind of hardcore games, which is to say that they are very punishing to play. But they do this in a different way. First of all, Noita is what we would refer to as a roguelike. And that is a game that is inspired by and utilizes a mechanic from a game called Rogue that I have never played, but I have played quite a few roguelikes, so I intuitively understand what that is. So that's the sort of thing that we could learn from playing a game like Noita. It also teaches you a whole bunch about Finnish mythology if you're interested. But Noita is a game that if you sit down and you start playing this game without knowing what you're getting into, a lot of people would refer to this game as a game for masochists. You'll play this game, you'll walk down into this mine, and you'll blow up, and you won't know why. And either you'll say, wow, that was really interesting. I wonder why I died. Time to go find out. And you'll go and you'll die again. Or you'll say, this game is stupid. Why would I play this? I play games to have fun. And then you'll close it and you'll never open it again because it's just horrible. It's such a good game. I love it. Dark Souls is similarly punishing, but Dark Souls does things a little differently. Noita, if you die, you're sent back to the main menu. You're starting over from the beginning. Dark Souls is different. You start that game, or any of the games in the franchises, and one of the first things that you are prepared for is the fact that your character and you as the player are not up to the task. You're referred to in one of the games as, I think, you get referred to as unkindled ash, and you're supposed to be effectively slaying gods. Just a little nobody who's got to do a lot. So you're initially set up with the expectation that you will fail. And you will. But when you do fail, you go back to a checkpoint called a bonfire. And you have a short little run that you've got to go back to wherever it is that you died. And you can recover everything that you lost if you don't die again before you get there. But you can usually figure out why you died in Dark Souls. Not always, but usually. And you can usually say, oh, I got to watch out for that move or that enemy or something. And so you can adapt to that and you can learn and you can grow. Dark Souls does a pretty good job of setting your expectations that failure is actually a form of progress. And that's very important. And I think that speaks to something that we talked about last time. And that's that thing where a lot of students don't want to speak up. They don't want to fail. They don't want to make mistakes. They just kind of want to coast and they kind of just want to eat what's put on their plate. Dark Souls does a really good job of creating a work ethic in a video game. Japanese developers really know what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's essentially exposure therapy to failure.
Yes, absolutely.
Come into the course, they're so scared of failing that they don't want to try, or that they're afraid to ask questions. So the more you make it acceptable to fail, the less of an impedance that becomes to them. It makes them braver as a result.
And another thing about these games is that it doesn't really spoil the experience to run into something that you don't understand or you don't know how to overcome. And just because you're not performing the science and figuring it out from scratch like everybody else, that's okay. There's no shame in looking up the Wikipedia. Well, there might be to some people, but we don't need to be that way. We don't need to be. But even if you do go on the Wikipedia and look up how to cheese this boss, as they say, you still have to do it. And it's still hard. And so you're still learning something. You're actually performing research because sometimes you might look something up and see something and not understand what's meant. Or you might look something up and it'll tell you to do something and it'll lead you astray and you'll die again. And you'll learn some things about asking for advice, and you'll learn some things about acquiring information on the internet because sometimes the advice will be better than others. You'll learn a certain form of literacy. Another interesting thing about Noita particularly is that Noita actually kind of teaches you some coding and programming principles with the way that the wand crafting works. They actually made another game called Baba Is You before they made Noita, and that one is unapologetically programming. And that game is extremely funny. So they have some great ones. And then there's the Titan of all Titans. And the easiest one to refer to would be Dungeons and Dragons, but there are many TTRPGs. And what they have to kind of offer us, where Dark Souls and Noita will teach us some things about maybe mythology, storytelling. Dark Souls is one of the most incredible storytelling examples out there because of its visual storytelling. It doesn't really hand you anything. You have to go looking for the story, but it is an incredibly good one. But TTRPGs can offer us anything we ask of them. So say I spent, I don't know, 6 days diving down a Wikipedia rabbit hole about astronomy and orbital mechanics. And I decide, you know what? I've suffered for this. And I think it's time to make my table, my friends, suffer for it too. So I decide I'm going to design a Dungeons and Dragons campaign where they have to defeat some evil entity or whatever that's on another planet, but they have to get there first. And they have to get there and they have to figure out and build a space-worthy mode of transportation that checks out within the mechanics of the world that I've designed, and they have to figure this out. And maybe they can go online, and maybe I've set it in a modern age where they have access to the internet, so they can actually sit there on their phones or on their laptops researching orbital mechanics and material sciences so that they can build their spaceship and go to wherever it is that I've determined they need to go to. I can make them do whatever I want, and it can still be fun because it can be a table of friends figuring out actual science. You know, the other nice thing as a bonus is Dungeons and Dragons has the opportunity to teach us all just a little bit about public speaking and acting as well. Like I was talking to Jim before anybody showed up about stage fright, which is that before I give these presentations, I don't know why. And I was saying to him, I don't really know why, but I have just this little flutter of stage fright. And I do stuff like this every week. It's not new to me. And I was telling him a story about when I was in college. And fun fact about me, I'm a dancer. So when I was in college and I was taking dance classes, I think I was 20 at the time. And one of the girls in my class was sitting in the fetal position against the wall backstage when we were about to go on and do this big dance showcase in this huge hall in front of, upwards of 1,000 people. And she was shaking and she looked up at me and I was just sort of walking around. She said, "How are you so calm?" And I said, "What do you mean? I'm not calm. I'm terrified too. I'm just doing a really good job of pretending that I'm not. I'm just acting to myself even." Like Dungeons and Dragons can teach you just a little bit about how to pretend you're someone that you're not, to the point where you can convince yourself that you are, and maybe everyone else too. And while that might seem and sound like a kind of obsequious skill to have, I would argue that it's not. Just sort of psyching yourself up is another way that a lot of people would put that. It's just kind of reinforcing to yourself that you know what you're doing and that it's going to be fine. And that's a really good skill to have. Fake it until you make it. Exactly. And sitting around with a table of friends where it's fairly safe to do, or a table of classmates where it's fairly safe to do, and trying on some stuff, seeing how it works for you, and seeing how confidence suits you. Learning a little acting, I don't think ever hurt anyone. I think it's a great skill to have in any field. So that's my 2 cents about TTRPGs. I think there's a different one for everyone. Some people really like the Pathfinder system. Some people are brave enough to write their own. But Dungeons and Dragons is out there, and it's easy enough to use. I would recommend it. But we can make custom ones as well, easily enough.
Yeah, and that, like you were saying, I just want to reiterate that point, that aside from learning the content here, these game styles are teaching people life skills. Like these are life skills everybody needs to know as an adult. How to present yourself, and like he was saying, public speaking, how to speak to or perform in front of thousands of people without actually being great. You have that exposure therapy that you've already engaged in by playing through the games in the way that they're presented to you.
Yeah, giving a villain monologue in your Dungeons and Dragons campaign, that's public speaking. It's pretending to do public speaking, but it'll get you part of the way there. And that's something. There are a lot of other titles that I would happily have on this list, and there are some other ones that we'll want to talk about next time. But a lot of the ones that didn't make it on this list just are not cohesive enough and condensed enough. But some of the interesting things that a lot of them bring up is sort of exposure therapy for kind of beating the panic reflex out of people. There are a lot of games that kind of jump scare you a lot. And helping people with freeze reflex is actually kind of a nice benefit that a lot of video games will impart. But we're not necessarily here to design exclusively video games. There are a lot of video game mechanics. We actually have a very nice list of them, but that's in the next set of slides, unfortunately. But since we are here and we have a couple of more minutes, and I've run out of monologue, is there anything that anyone wants to ask about or talk about, or any points that anyone wants to go over? Any questions or any, doubts even? Happy to talk about doubts.
I think I just kind of, the Dark Souls really spoke to what I'm trying to do, because I'm in a clinical setting. And so we just throw students into this clinical setting where they're around experts all the time, and they're trying to take care of these people who are sick. And so that really kind of spoke to me. And then I used AI and I said, okay, how can I do this with that first acute care hospital setting? And I think it's interesting to see how can I do it with real people, so I'm like safe, right? So how do I build a safety mechanism? Because yes, you can maybe not, you can do a low risk task like assessing a patient. They could forget to listen to their stomach, but and that's okay. But there's other things where you can't fail.
Right.
Well, and one thing that I brought up in a different meeting that I had earlier today, actually, it is possible to do real life, simulations. And I think that would be a great opportunity to partner with maybe the theater department for some people who would be willing to take on a role of a patient.
And that was actually a thing that happened at my university. They had the theater kids line up and pose as patients with different roles that they had to play with the psych department. And they had basically mock therapy sessions. So it was an assignment for both classes. And apparently that went really, really well. So yeah, I would encourage stuff like that for sure. Because it's a realistic thing, but it is a game. Because nobody risks death over that. That actually reminded me of what you'd said about trying to kind of equate Dark Souls with these situations where you can't really afford to fail. Was some short form content that I saw about, and this has become kind of a trend. It's some creators where there may be a doctor or maybe a psychologist or cooking YouTubers will sometimes take dishes from fiction, from film or something. You'll have Binging with Babish, and he'll make the ratatouille from Ratatouille. And he'll say, it was pretty gross, honestly. Things like that. And that's pretty fun. Or Dr. K will diagnose all of the Harry Potter characters, and that's kind of fun. That's actually a really interesting idea. There are a lot of classes where you could do interesting stuff like that, sort of like what I had talked about with what is the physics of Yoda trying to raise the X-Wing out of the swamp with the Force. What are the clinical diagnoses of Henry of Astora and Horus? What's wrong with these guys? What's going on here? Maybe you could definitely do a lot of engineering questions with a lot of video games, but you could essentially just take something that is quick to get people familiar with. You could say your homework for the first week of class is to go home and play this video game or watch this TV show. And then they come in the next time and they say, all right, we're going to discuss this as though it were real. And that just adds an element of fun to it because it gives people kind of a break to go and do a thing that they might like to do anyway. And then they get to pick it apart for science. And that can be fun.
Yeah, Jesse, I think you actually have a number of films and TV shows that you referenced in your gender studies classes that would work for something like this.
Yes, I have one every week. So I'm excited to think about how that can work.
And that was a question I had, because and Jesse, it looks like you can get around that because you're giving them what you want them to look at. And so now it becomes like a shared culture. I feel like because the way, right, I mean, Netflix, HBO, like all of our streaming services, we're all on different platforms. Like, is there still pop culture that we are all a part of and that we all know? Like for my generation, it was definitely Harry Potter, but I don't really know for Gen Z, like what's a shared pop culture that they have? I think that was a question I had from the beginning of this.
I don't know about shared pop culture, but I'll just throw out there that we have at least two services that we can access as faculty: Canopy as a streaming service where we can, and there's lots of clinical stuff because I'm a psych master's person, used to work in clinical psychology. So there's Canopy, and there's one other, I'm blanking on its name right now. It might be Alexander Street, but I can send it to folks if you're interested. So even if it's not popular cultural stuff, at least it's an entry point for a shared conversation in the course. I don't know if that's not quite as good, but
I think the answer to the question of if there's like a truly shared like cultural zeitgeist for Gen Z and Gen Alpha is like no. I mean obviously the rotten part of my brain says, oh, obviously it's Skibbity Toilet. I still to this day don't know what that is.
Heaven is clearly where we need to be.
Oh yes, you're right. You're right. I still also don't know what that is, but I know it exists. But the answer to that is, if there is, only they will know. And so that's kind of why I'm like, as soon as we can, we want to try to be leveraging their creative ability, because like, I remember when I was probably 16 or 17, I kind of thought to myself, when I grow up, when I have kids, I'm going to keep up. I'm going to be literate. I'm going to know what's going on with my kids and their culture. And I was wrong, and I don't even have kids yet. Like, God, it's just not possible. And if it is, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm online plenty, but Google knows that I'm old. It doesn't show me the same stuff, you know? So, right. And another part of it is that even when we do come across the things that they are familiar with at their age, it's so easy and tempting to be like, yeah, but things that were from my generation were better. And you know what? We're probably right, but that doesn't matter because they are part of that. And because they're part of it, it's important. It's important to them. So letting them build a lot of that stuff is going to be good. But for now, we're what we've got. So we'll just have to do our best. Anyway, I think that's Jim waving at me to shut up now.
No, I was just because she had to leave, and so I figured we'd respect everyone's time. But we can hang out if anybody has any more questions, or you can always get a hold of me, and we can have a chat, and maybe bring in Nigel if necessary to just work on some fun ideas. Because again, it always comes back to, it doesn't just have to be fun for the students; it also has to be fun for you. It has to be enriching and adventurous and exciting for you to be able to even be inspired to go do this in the first place if you want to integrate this kind of strategy into your courses.
Right.
So I guess with that, if anybody doesn't have any questions, we'll just wrap this up.